Good evening to all of you. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability and OP Jindal Global University to this Environment and Sustainability Colloquium. The theme of today's colloquium is Saving the World from the Next Big Crisis. Can youth be the environmental change makers? This colloquium is organized at a time when the world is facing one of the biggest crises, the public health crisis in the form of a pandemic. As we battle this crisis, it's important for some of us to also think about other possible crises that might happen in the future. And one such is the environmental one, which we're going to discuss today. Rapidly increasing carbon emissions, exposure to disproportionately decreasing air quality, threat of extinction to 1 million animal and plant species are few of the many environmental challenges we face today. And amidst all this environmental chaos, our already large population of 7.8 billion people is expected to grow by nearly 2 billion in the next 3 decades, depleting the resources around us. If we condense the Earth lifespan to 24 hours, human mankind has been here for 3 seconds, in which we have significantly modified our environment to fit the needs of the society, enough to cost our own lives and indeed our future. With the current unprecedented crisis of the COVID-19, which in itself may be an outcome of humanity's long-term assault on the natural world, today we are faced with the responsibility to reinvent our lives, to secure our youth a safe and good environment for the future. In fact, the idea of intergenerational equity is so inherently connected to ideas and notions of sustainability that we intend to talk today. As Mahatma Gandhi once said, Earth provides enough to satisfy every man's needs, but not every man's greed. Environmental crisis we face today is indeed a crisis of consciousness. It's high time that we reset our priorities and identify various instruments of change, today's youth being one of them. All of us know the inspiring contribution of Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg's speech at the World Economic Forum stirred emotions and sent a no-snooze alarm bells across the globe. If one teenager can make such a difference, then imagine what a population of over 1 billion youth across the globe today can do, given the right platform and the right set of priorities and perspectives. There has been a surge in youth-led environmental initiatives and youth-driven green startups across the world. Given the ability of the youth to drive change, can youth be ambassadors of sustainability and green innovation? Should we do more to harness the energy, intellect, and passion of today's youth to drive a greener economy? What action should we take to give them the right platform to their vision? How can we raise the profile of higher education to transform the youth into responsible environmental leaders? This colloquium is therefore a very important opportunity, especially as we close in on the World Environment Day to be celebrated on 5th June, to address the potential and the role of today's youth as environmental change makers to save the world from the next big crisis. I have with me a fantastic panel of 5 distinguished individuals from different walks of life who have themselves made contributions in this regard. Let me begin by introducing Professor Stephen P. Marks. Steve Marks is the Professor of Health and Human Rights at the Harvard Sinha School of Public Health, where he directs the program on human rights and development. With degrees in law and international relations from Stanford and several universities in France, as well as the Syrian Arab Republic, he has worked for the United States Senate in Washington, D.C., the International Institute of Human Rights, Strasbourg in France, UNESCO, Paris in France, the Ford Foundation in New York, and the UN peacekeeping operations in Cambodia. He has taught at the Columbia University and Princeton University, among others, and has been at Harvard University since 1999. Thank you, Steve, for joining us.
My pleasure.
We have with us Professor Dr. Armand Rosenkrantz, who is the founding dean of the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability at OP Jindal Global University. Professor Rosenkrantz is a distinguished American educator, an inspiring teacher, a prolific researcher, education administrator, and an accomplished scholar. Professor Rosenkrantz is a lawyer by training and also a political scientist. He has a PhD, a JD, and an MA from Stanford University and an undergraduate degree from Princeton University. He founded the Pacific Environment, an international environmental NGO that he led for 9 years. He taught energy and climate for many years at Stanford, and he's also the author of one of the most influential and important books on Indian environmental law. Thank you, Armand, for joining us today.
Happy to.
We have with us Ms. Disha Sharma, is the Energy Efficiency Coordinator in India at the International Energy Agency. She has nearly 7 years of experience in clean energy and environmental sector. She is currently engaged with the IEA in managing the energy efficiency work programs and portfolio with Bureau of Energy Efficiency in India. Prior to joining IEA, Ms. Sharma worked for International Institute for Energy Conservation and the Energy and Research Institute, TERI, where she worked on developing the energy productivity roadmap for India. Ms. Sharma is an electrical engineer and holds a master's degree in energy studies from the IIT in Delhi. Thank you, Disha, for joining us. We have with us Dr. Sinha, who is the Distinguished Officer of the Indian Forest Service, belonging to the Uttarakhand cadre. He holds a PhD in wildlife science. He's also a Fulbright Nehru Fellow and a recipient of several awards for his contribution to wildlife conservation. He has served as the director of the Corbett Tiger Reserve, Rajaji Tiger Reserve, Nanda Devi Biosphere Reserve, and also as head Traffic India in WWF. Presently, he's serving as additional Principal Chief Conservator of Forests and Chief Executive Officer of the Uttarakhand Compensatory Afforestation Fund Management Authority at Dehradun. Thank you, Dr. Sinha, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. A pleasure and a privilege.
Ms. Radhika Suri, who's the Director of the Environmental Education at WWF India. Ms. Suri has been associated with the country's leading conservation organization, WWF India, since 2015. She's a passionate and versatile educationist with over 3 decades of extensive experience in teaching, curriculum development, setting up and management of schools and teacher training. She has been instrumental in drafting a strategy for implementation of environmental education programs across the nation. In a short span of 2 years at WWF India, she has conceptualized and successfully implemented many educational programs for school children, youth, and senior citizens in both rural and urban setups. With that introduction, let me begin this evening's discussion. My first question is to Professor Stephen Marks, the founding dean of the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability. Professor Armin Rosenkrantz, the founding dean of Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability. Armin, we have, of course, started a new school, but before you talk about the school itself, I would like you to speak a bit about the larger context of environmental challenge that we're facing. Climate change, deforestation, pollution, loss of biodiversity, increasing population are some of the biggest threats to a sustainable environment. There are predictions that we might be facing one of the largest species extinction as well. So my question is, what's the hope for the future? Is studying environment a part of the hope for the future, Armin?
Not only is studying environment the hope of the future, youth is the hope for the future. And youth changing and advancing the environment is what's going to save us all. Right now, most of the climate litigation that's happening around the world is driven by youth, including in India and in the United States. The youth in India, for example, not too many people probably know this, but there's a young woman, teenager called Ridhima Pandey, and she has brought a suit against the government of India to try to get more activity on behalf of the environment and particularly climate change. This has happened also in the Netherlands, the United States, Colombia, Pakistan, and elsewhere. This has become a real movement led by the youth. And in terms of climate change, the only way to really deal with climate change is through clean energy. And again, the youth is involved in supporting clean energy around the world, supporting solar energy, wind energy, even nuclear energy, against a lot of prejudice and superstition on the part of some communities who believe that this is going to disturb their everyday life. It's not true. It won't disturb it. It'll enhance it. But that message has to be carried forward by the youth, and it is being done now.
Thank you so much, Armin, for really setting the stage for our discussion. For all those who are watching this, we are live on YouTube and Facebook. Please send in your questions. After this part of the first segment of the discussion, we will also take up several questions from our audience as well. Now, since Armin raised the issue of youth, I want to quickly move to Radhika. Radhika, you've been at the vanguard of an organization which has provide leadership in India and around the world. The WWF is known for its work in the field of environment. So my question to you is that how can specialization in environmental studies help shape the youth into ethical and responsible citizens? I mean, how should higher education institutions integrate sustainability and environmental best practices into their curriculum? I mean, the real question is, how should not just people who are studying, let's say, a BA in environmental studies focus on environment, but a student who's actually studying BCom, a Bachelor of Commerce degree, for example, should focus on the study of environment as well. Should the study of environment be democratized? Radhika.
Yeah. So this is something that's really, close to my heart. And I always think, and it started this whole thought that you have put in the question started that our full education system, says that the eco club teacher or the teacher who's fond of the environment will teach it, or a child who does a course in higher education will actually, just do the environment thing. But why? What do you call those societies? An eco club, a green society in a college is only responsible for environment. But the point is, we all breathe this air. We all consume water. We consume so many free services from the environment. So why have we built a structure where only if you like the environment, you can, work towards it or you contribute towards it? I think so. It's everybody's moral duty. Like we always believe that, it's inappropriate to lie, right? It's absolutely mocked at, and it's something we don't do. We are honest people. So similarly, I feel to the environment, the whole, environment education, we should move it to an approach. It should be a way of life. It should be the way you and I lead my life. And therefore, educational institutions, colleges and schools should have this culture. So I just feel there needs to be an extreme shift on this. We need to, from the top, from the head, from every department, understand that this environment is ours, this earth is ours, and we use it mindlessly. And it's just not that if you're connected to, if you're studying it, you are, the ones who will be the protectors of it. So I think there needs a full system change on this. And there have been, attempts like there is a paper that every graduate has to pass. So there have been, suggestions like this. At the school level, we do have environment studies. But I think so we need to understand that you can study it. That's a specialization. But there is a cultural shift that needs to happen, which is that we all need to imbibe that value of taking care, respecting, watching what we do. And I think that's going to have a huge difference on the footprint that's there, the way we consume and lead our lives. So I do feel educational institutions should first take a pledge to become green colleges. And it's just the way, we decide to respect, the earth, like we respect humanity by not lying.
Thank you so much,
yeah.
Radhika. Thank you very much for that. Let me move to Dr. Sameer Sinha. Dr. Sinha, you have spent a good part of your life working for the government and in many ways implementing and enforcing policies and rules and regulations, even laws relating to wildlife protection. My first question to you is that, do you think that governments generally value the importance and protection of environment? I ask this question because of the fact that in the larger imagination of government, issues that ministries and departments with focus on trade and investment and commerce and finance end up getting far greater attention than ministries and departments which work broadly in the field of environment. And many a time they do come in loggerheads. So if you can reflect about the importance of protecting the environment from the side of the government, that will be very helpful.
Thank you. First of all, there is no question or no doubt about the fact that the environment is something that we all have a lot of regard for, a lot of respect for. And there is a whole mechanism by which laws and policies have been framed to ensure that these of our priceless resources are looked into. But at the same time, we must acknowledge that we live in an era where the welfare state dominates. There are aspirations of our populations, and the role models that we have are not very great across the world because their consumption models are the ones that are set up before us as wonderful and great. And for example, I would talk about something that again is very interesting, which is called the global footprint. And where does this lead us to? We have something called the Earth Overshoot Day. And this is the day on which a given country surpasses the annual production that the Earth is capable of providing and starts eating into the capital. And the Global Earthshoot Day in 2019 fell on July 29, which means that for all of us, every single day spent after July 29 is basically something that we've been eating out of the capital. And it is this kind, and for comparison, India basically is still needing only about 0.7 portion of the earth as compared to nations that utilize almost 4.5 times the annual offtake that the earth has to offer. So our aspirational models are completely unrealistic, which is what creates the clash between the aspirations and what we can actually achieve. And that is where sometimes we end up on the losing side, because when we are able to pitchfork our claims, our requirements, then on the other side, yes, they are very powerful controlling forces. And sometimes, yes, they are able to prevail, because the other thing that we need to realize and appreciate is that environment seems to be still largely an elitist case. We do not have a people's movement as far as environment is concerned that encompasses the entire globe. Political parties don't fight elections on an agenda that is necessarily environment centric. And trees don't vote, tigers don't vote. So this is something that we'll have to keep in mind.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha, for that really tour de force on the evolution of the role of the government itself and the priorities that we need to have. Let me move to Disha. Disha, I think the organization that you work obviously is a very interesting one. Why don't you reflect a bit about the current situation itself? I mean, we know that the global carbon emissions are estimated to have reduced by around 17% in the recent months. A recent research states that reduced pollution due to the temporary pause in human lives is likely to have saved nearly 80,000 lives in just China alone. On the other hand, there's been a surge in deforestation in Amazon. So what will be the net impact of COVID-19 on the environment? Now, how will this shape the environmental crisis in the post-corona world, which we hope to reach? So given the current decline in energy-related CO2 emissions, what role does energy efficiency play in the COVID-19 scenario, or rather post-COVID-19 scenario? Please, Disha.
Yeah, thank you. So climate and energy are interrelated. There exists a bi-directional relationship between these two.
Disha, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I was saying that energy and
We're not able to
climate
see you,
are
Disha.
energy and climate are interrelated. What we've seen in the recent pandemic, what we've seen is Yeah, am I visible and audible now?
You're not visible, but you're audible.
Yeah, so I guess that works.
Okay.
Yeah, so what I was just saying that energy is affecting the way our climate is taking place because there's a bi-directional relationship. Climate change dictates how we form our energy systems and how we use these energy systems has a direct impact on our climate.
Isha, we'll come back to you. I think there is some problem in your audio and video. Let me go to Steve. Steve, let me, one of the things which I would like you to reflect is that the role of youth as you see. I mean, I think it is only fair to say that the youth of the world have in many ways risen up to the challenge. Obviously, it does, there have been youth-related movements both before Greta, but also continuing after Greta as well. If you can reflect on the role of the youth in the entire environmental movement and how it has the potential to change the future generations' mindset regarding protecting the environment, that will be very helpful. Please, Steve.
Thank you very much, Raj. It's a pleasure to be part of this exercise. On that subject of the role of youth, obviously there are levels at which youth intervene. The world has been deeply impressed by what is represented by the interventions that Greta Thunberg has made in various global fora, and she has found the words to galvanize opinions about the responsibility, the failure of our generation and all the generations older than her to rise up to their responsibilities. But that's not enough. Things are happening at several levels. Throughout the UN system, there is an effort to integrate youth into the reflection and decision-making process. The Framework Convention on Climate Change has formally adopted since 2009 a constituency for youth to be part of the operation. The principal efforts in the UN are through a Youth and United Nations Joint Framework Initiative on Children, Youth, and Climate Change, the Joint Framework Initiative, and 16 intergovernmental entities throughout the UN and many youth organizations empower youth to take adoption and mitigation actions that enhance effective participation of youth in climate change policy and decision-making policies. Now that's a lot of wishful thinking. Formally, these institutions say, youth, we're listening. Youth, you're welcome. Come to the table. We are listening. The fact is, youth who are mobilized around the climate issue in some of the litigation that Armin was referring to earlier, and in other organizations like the Sunrise Movement, are much clearer on the power relations. Youth are not going to tell adults what to do. That was the reason for the dramatic power of Greta Thunberg's message. As one of the members of the Sunrise Movement stated, generally around her theme, doing nothing is a death sentence to my generation, a 19-year-old young woman from California stated the following: fossil fuel money in our politics is the main obstacle to climate policy, in my opinion. There's only so much that public opinion can do if the politicians are bought out by fossil fuel billionaires and executives. I feel like young people have always played the role of moral clarity and being willing to be idealists about what the world should be like. I see my generation as picking up the baton from the young people in the 1960s and of the civil rights movement who engaged in similar efforts. We totally see our struggle as rooted in the past activism of young people. So they understand, at least movement like this one understands, that having a place at the table by generous older generations saying, come, we want to hear you, is not enough. They need to be shaken to the core. They need to challenge the power structures that are behind the maintenance of the energy system that is responsible for our current climate crisis. I hope that gets at the point that you were raising, Raj, in your question.
Thank you very much, Steve. We seem to have some difficulty with Disha's internet, and she might join us, but let's move forward. Armin, in a world where we often witness environmental discrimination of different kinds, those whose lives are impacted significantly, what role can youth play in the movement of seeking environmental justice? What can be done in particular to enable the youth in developing countries and even rural areas of a country to play instruments of change in overcoming more localized environmental discrimination of some kind, where the adverse impact of environmental consequences are far more disproportionately damaging to their lives than it is in other places? Armin.
Okay, well, first, the youth has to connect with one another, not only within the country, but across countries. There needs to be, perhaps under UN sponsorship, an effort made for the youth to connect all over the world. Many of these issues are international, and therefore international law will not really operate. International agreements need to be enforced domestically. So, because they're not self-enforcing. So the youth needs to get involved in publicity, in aggressive publicity, to motivate people, to publicize what they're doing, to publicize the issues, and I would say that maybe we need to have green awards for youth. We need to maybe motivate some of the individuals with special incentives to motivate more youth action. And also in terms of environmental racism or environmental justice, the youth can say, okay, let's have a toxic chemical operation right here in our community. Then you would get a lot of activity on the part of the whole community, not only the young people, but the corporations and the older people, to get involved and to modify, moderate, or ameliorate the toxic chemicals that might otherwise flow. So the youth, can advocate that we have toxic chemicals and power plants in rich communities, to get everybody involved in dealing with it, because we have the technology, and we have the money. So with the money and the technology, I think we can deal with all these. You just need the motivation. And if you can motivate people by worrying about their own backyard, then I think you'll get some progress.
Well, thank you so much, Armin, for that. Let me move to Radhika. So Radhika, one of the things that's clearly emerging is that there is a role for the youth. Now, how do you translate and even elevate the role of the youth from an altruistic sort of desirable, even hobbies and even extracurricular activities focusing on environment to something more substantive? How do we invest in having volunteering opportunities, environmental careers, green internships, even student development funds to incentivize responsible environmental studentship, which can actually foster the development of core values and belief among the youth? In some ways, how do you make environmental consciousness beyond a desirable objective something much more integral to the educational imagination of youth?
Yeah, so we started in WWF India, we started, with a movement. And this year we are completing our 50 years, and we started a movement called the Nature Clubs of India. So at that point of time, we really, took youth and students and citizens out on, nature camps and in the outdoors, and, kind of made them value nature, understand nature, and also, they understood coexistence. We have many examples of, people who kind of then later on went on to do their masters in ecology. In fact, many a time, when I go out for any seminar or conference, invariably, if somebody sees me wearing a panda badge, comes to me and says, once I was a nature club's, student. So we, at that point of time, I think so, this was something that, worked. And currently, how our, programs have evolved, like you had mentioned at the beginning, we looked at a strategy. We have looked at, creating different opportunities for you to, come and understand conservation, understand environment. And one of our programs is a volunteering program called WWF Volunteers, where we put up projects. We tell anybody to come and participate in it. And when they join us, while they contribute towards our work, we also contribute educating them about the whole journey of education. So it's a very informal way of, educating people about conservation. So I have this boy, Pankaj, who just, he was a software engineer, and he came with us, and he came to volunteer for, of course, a certificate initially. But eventually, over a period of time, he got, so immersed in this. And I think so now he's working with WII as a research assistant. So there's been a total career shift. So I think so exposing them to this field is extremely critical. And I just wanted to say one thing more, while we keep burdening the youth with, now you need to, take this problem forward and you need to do something. As an educator, I have been observing, and I really feel with technology, I find the young generation very inspiring. They are able to think out of the box. And while we need Greta's and people to protest and create these strikes, I think so that they also have a lot of potential and should be directed and channeled in the right direction. And hence, colleges should have, exposure to such things, to even event like this, where you're exposing them to these thoughts. I think so these will play a very big role in letting them, find their path. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Radhika, for that. We are live on YouTube and Facebook, and we have already received over 100 questions. We will come back to you. Please send in your questions, and we will get to that shortly. Let me move to Dr. Sinha. Dr. Sinha, we know that the value of illegal wildlife trade is stated to be billions of dollars annually in India, around the world. Now, given the speculations around the source of coronaviruses, has COVID-19 in fact been exacerbated by humanity's long-term assault on the natural world, an irresponsible assault despite knowing the risks associated with it? Is there any possible cure for the future, and how do you respond to this?
Well, the estimated global value of legal wildlife trade is about $300 billion plus. And the annual global estimate for illegal wildlife trade is up to $20 to $25 billion annually. And that's a lot of zeros. But so far, illegal wildlife trade has been primarily looked at two levels. One is the threat to species extinction, and the second is the law enforcement angle. But what we now realize, and what COVID-19 has told the whole wide world, is that there is a huge problem of illegal wildlife trade as a threat to human security, human health. And that is where I would see this as an opportunity of bringing this aspect of illegal wildlife trade before the whole wide world. But the other important thing for us to remember is that COVID-19 is certainly not the first one. We had SARS, we had MERS, we have HIV, we have all kind of things happening around us. The problem so far has been that we don't really seem to have learned our lessons. What essentially happens is that, for example, we've talked about wet markets. There's a lot of attention on wet markets. There's a lot of global demand now wet market should be closed. But I'm not sure uh, most people who raise these kind of demands really understand what's going on at the ground level. What essentially is happening is that when the trade is illegal, most of the species which are picked up as part of a bouquet from across the world, they are dumped into conditions which are alien to their natural habitat. They are dumped in close proximity with species which they would normally not come across in their entire lifetime. And they are under stress. There is no quarantine, which means they are really shedding all kind of disease around them. And some of these cross thresholds and then enter the human system, because they at every level they keep coming into contact with human beings. Where I hope and pray COVID-19 will be different is that this is the first time this kind of a situation is being played out in the full glare of social media globally. So every kid on the planet who has access to a phone, every young adult, every senior person knows on a day-to-day basis what's happening. I'm not sure how much of that information is correct, but at the same time, this information is live. Never have we seen in our lifetimes all flights across the world being stopped. Words like lockdown have entered our daily usage. So this is something that I hope will leave an everlasting memory on our minds. And as one of my friends has been saying, that we now live in a world where it is before COVID and after COVID. So hopefully some of these lessons will be learned, and we will learn to treat natural ecosystems and species with much more respect than what we have been doing so far. That is the only way, to my mind, that we can ensure ourselves against similar instances for the future.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha. I believe Disha is with us now. She can hear us. Disha, can you hear us?
Yes, I can, and I
Okay, great.
apologize for this
No
inconvenience.
problem, Disha. So the question that we were discussing with you was that about the global reduction in the global carbon emissions, and we kind of towards the end I asked you that what will be the net impact of COVID-19 on the environment? How will this shape the future environmental crisis in the post-corona world?
Yeah, so energy is very closely linked with air pollution and GHG emissions. I mean, about two-thirds of the CO2 emissions or global GHG emissions come from the energy sector. So there is an important need to maintain and optimize the energy sector. What we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic is that there has been reduced industrial demand, reduced demand for electricity, oil demand has dropped significantly, and this has led to reduction in fossil fuel combustion. As a consequence, air quality has improved dramatically. But all this is for wrong reasons because of the paused human activities. As soon as these human activities will revive, there is a chance that air quality will go back to being what it was. In fact, in Delhi itself, during the fourth lockdown, when government announced some relaxation for the construction sector and for the industrial sector, the air quality of Delhi went back to being poor from good just overnight. This is what energy sector does to the local air pollution and local air quality. What also COVID-19 has done is it has made people realize how it will look like to breathe cleaner air. So this is going to put too much pressure on the governments to actually develop the energy sector policies in a manner so as to tap its effect and benefit it has on climate. If I just start from power sector, if we are able to implement all air pollution standards and decarbonize the power sector, about 90% of the SOx emission will reduce by 2040. Similarly, for the transport sector, if we are able to move towards cleaner technologies and stronger fuel standards, the local air pollution will drop by 40%. And it's true for all sectors of which are basically subsectors of energy, be it buildings, be it industries, and be it transport. Now, the challenge is that COVID-19 should be seen as an opportunity rather than as a setback by the government to actually implement and fast forward cleaner energy transitions, because climate change and air pollution comes as co-benefits if we are able to optimize our energy systems. And this will lead in reduction to CO2 emissions. So strategies such as scaling up energy efficient lighting, street lighting systems, scaling up energy efficient appliances, constructing energy efficient buildings should be prioritized, because this will not only help the government to fight the pandemic, reduce their pollution, but also help them revive their economies in terms of creating jobs in cleaner energy scenarios. So there is a chance that if we are not able to tap the opportunity which is in front of us, we'll then again go back onto the similar path, and the path wherein we are not meeting our climate negotiations.
Thank you very much, Disha. That was fascinating. Well, Steve, let me ask you this question from, Disha is saying that clearly we need a reimagination of the way, we function. And the heart of the problem of environment and sustainability is that. Now, in this context, we have a situation where youth leaders and iconic people such as Greta are speaking about what we should do. And then there are politicians and bureaucrats and businesses who are not listening. So the question to you is the Greta effect is a classic representation of the global impact driven by youth to protect the environment? There has been a surge in youth-led environmental initiatives such as Sustain US and Green Youth Movement of the Philippines, many other countries. What role you think youth can play in this, in which they can move from activists to actually power holders and hopefully moving towards exercising power for the benefit of the environment?
Youth mobilization is visible on the streets now around racial justice issues. Youth mobilization has been seen in the past and is continuing on with the organizations you've mentioned and many, many others among youth being engaged in environmental issues. One of the phenomena that does give me some hope is that I've noticed that the more engaged the youth become beyond their awareness that adults have not done the right thing and the world is a mess and it needs to be made better, and there is discrimination and there is racism and there is environmental injustice and so on. Their maturity of thought, at least I've observed through many of these organizations and institutions, leads them to acknowledge that they need to alter their career choices and their political behavior. Career choices means, obviously, and this is part of another focus of this discussion today, of the new types of entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, the new types of educational careers, the new types of program like Armin is setting up here and so on, to have careers where they will devote their entire lives to improving the situation. They will become the decision makers of the future. The second way in which youth are altering from, are moving from an awareness that the adults from whom they're inheriting this planet have failed to maintain the health of the planet, is political engagement. To mobilize, to say, we will run for election locally. We will, once we attain the age to become candidates for election, we will fight for the green agenda. And we will support candidates who support the green agenda. Obviously, we're seeing a great polarization in some of the major countries. You can't imagine more dramatic examples than in the United States and Brazil, and to a lesser extent in, well, also to a pretty great extent in other countries where populist authoritarianism prevails. But the battle goes on. Were it not for populist authoritarian regimes, this youth movement engaging not only in their careers, but into politics, would probably have more of an impact already. We wouldn't be so far behind in meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement as we are today. So my summary of what I'm trying to say in answer to your question is that youth have demonstrated their capacity to show awareness, challenge the adults, challenge the institutions that are failing to do it, and then secondly, to become engaged in their own choice of careers, and thirdly, to be engaged politically, to be elected or to support candidates who have a green agenda.
Thank you, Steve, for really throwing some light about how youth can play an active part in the future of politics and governance as well. Well, for all those who are watching, I know that you have over 150 plus questions. Please send in them. We promise you that we will take it up. We are live on Facebook and YouTube. Armin, now this actually takes me quite nicely to a very fundamental question that I'm sure you are keen to answer. You have begun to lead a new school, the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability, at a time when the world is facing this pandemic, but also future crises. What do you hope to achieve through the school, and indeed the possibility of young people pursuing environmental studies in India?
Okay, well, young people are advocates, first and foremost. They're advocates for environmental improvement, environmental change. And it's not, I want young people not only to be involved in political action and maybe personal direct action. For example, in England, young people occupied a power plant, a new power plant. And they said they do that to make the world and the community aware of climate change. They were exonerated by the courts because of their message, and the courts felt that, yes, occupying a power plant may have involved impacting private property, but the message that they were trying to get across was so much more important than the problems that they were creating for private property. That I think is a good example. Not to say, I don't want too many young people to subject themselves to arrest, but thinking about the possibility of direct action and of gaining publicity and attention is important. The other thing that is important that we haven't yet mentioned is the corporate sector. Multinational corporations are not the enemy. They are, and half the people probably watching this webinar are going to be involved in the corporate sector at some point in their lives. So your parents and grandparents, uncles and aunts are also likely to be involved. So dealing with the corporate sector and instilling the corporate sector with a sense of corporate social responsibility and shareholder actions in that behalf are going to be part of your mission. Young advocates, as shareholders, as participants in the corporate sector, can move the corporate sector to be much more aware of the environment and of environmental responsibility.
Thank you very much, Armin. Radhika, I want to take this question to you. I mean, Armin, of course, seems to have a strong belief in the idea of youth-based activism. And we also know that in many other movements which we have seen, there is a very delicate balancing act that means that activism with responsibility on the one hand, and activism moving into a more anarchist notions of seeking different forms of justice. So my question to you is, Radhika, how do you mobilize the power of youth to have a more meaningful and a more impactful and a more responsible form of activism, whereby they recognize the role of the private sector, including corporations, companies, and business enterprises, and see them to some extent allies in the larger effort to promote environmental sustainability?
Yeah, so I just want to say that, I think so, a few days back, I was telling you that, we had a simulation of a conference of parties, and a question was put out to, those 72 delegates. And my question was, what do you think of Greta Thunberg? And one of them stood up and he said to me that the youth will always be indebted to Greta because she united all of us. She told us that, we really need to raise our voice. But the same group also said that while we're grateful to her for that, we believe that we need to be more in a solution mode. And therefore, through that, mock simulation that we had, we taught them governance, we taught them leadership, we taught them certain skills on how to actually solve such complex problems. So I think so that's a very, critical direction that the youth need to be led. And like I said earlier, I have great faith. I work with this group for 7 days. I cannot even tell you, they were talking back to me. So even like sometimes I feel teachers have become redundant, you can Google answers. So I do feel they have the mindset and the brain. It's the way you channelize them. So I think so what Greta and certain people have done is our environment message has always been hidden, and we have not been, have had very strong communication of our, environmental issues or problems. So I think so that is done, and the youth should move in a very, very constructive way and solve solutions. So like, we have a program called ECHO, where we told them to work on SDG 12 and 13. So we give them the knowledge, the skill, the expertise, and then let them, come up with ideas, and you'll be surprised with what all they come up with. So I think so pushing them towards the right careers, encouraging them to become entrepreneurs, green entrepreneurs, that's absolutely critical. So I think so this has also served one purpose, but I feel, and also advocacy should happen in an informed way. We should not be, we have lots of problems in the world, and I think so we need to put that in front and not, just focus on one thing. We have to look at
Fantastic.
society at large. Yeah.
Fantastic, Radhika. That's a very powerful statement. Advocacy should happen in an informed manner. Let me move to Dr. Sinha. Dr. Sinha, how can we quantify and account for environmental services in the modern world as a tool to bring about greater awareness about the intrinsic value of natural ecosystems and to promote sustainability? The heart of this question is connected to what Radhika said and drawing upon what Armin said as well, which is that if we were to make people conscious and responsible for their actions, it has to start somewhere in looking at, incentives and even recognition of responsibilities and possibly partnerships and collaborations. How do we begin that journey?
Well, Coco Chanel at one point in time made this wonderful statement that the best things in life are free. The second best things are very, very expensive. And on that note, I believe that valuation of the ecosystem services that natural ecosystems provide is something that has come of age. For too long, the planning process in not just in India, but on a global level has completely ignored the broad ecological concerns when it comes to assessing growth. And I say growth in inverted commas, because that model of growth only takes into account material goods and not about the best things in life that are free, like air, water, and a certain quality of life. So what is happening is that we believe, as I said earlier, that we have a lot of catching up to do. And because of that, and the fact that these ecosystem services are largely freely available to the larger population, we do not consider them as having any market value, and they are public goods, which is why they are not often accounted or most likely ignored when it comes to taking hard decisions. And I will speak for Corbett Tiger Reserve, for example. Some years ago, there was a study done on the economic valuation of Corbett Tiger Reserve and came up with very interesting results. The annual flow benefits from Corbett, which is in an area of 1,288 square kilometers, was estimated at 14.72 billion rupees a year. And the non-flow benefits, the stock benefits, the value of timber, the carbon sequestration value and all, was estimated to be 261 billion rupees. The interesting thing is that only 9% of these flow benefits accrued at the local level, 53% at the national level, and 39% at the global level, which means that by conserving these areas, the value that accrues is not just limited to a local landscape. And more interestingly, the calculation said that for every rupee invested in the management of a place like Corbett, the return on investment was 368. Now, I would like to believe that this is probably the best return to investment ratio on any enterprise anywhere in the world today. The challenge is that because these things are not accounted for, these are not as part of the decision making. And a very interesting concept that has now come up is that these values are now called the GDP of the poor. It is because most of these benefits are are taken by local communities which may not have so much access to organized markets. And because it is these people who benefit, sometimes when it comes to decision making, their role is negated and it is not accounted for, which is why it is very, very important in the present scenario to calculate these costs, calculate these values, and bring them on the accounting board so that any decision that involves uh, anything to do with these areas also takes into account, because we live in a world where zeros matter. Zeros really matter, and I think if we have this on a plate before us, then decision making will perhaps be in a very different mode than what we see today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha, for that. If Disha is still around, is Disha, are you there?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So Disha, maybe we should just now move into one of the things that we started earlier. How are climate change and energy sector interlinked? And how do improvements in energy sector ensure environmental sustainability in the future? Now, why should young people think of this as an evolving field that requires intervention from a sustainability standpoint? And how can the energy sector utilize and engage more young people to play an active role?
Yeah. Climate and energy communicate with each other. There's a bi-directional relationship and bi-communication relationship which is there. But the sad part is that climate and energy are not often talked about together as often they should have been. Mostly when people are developing or governments are developing their climate action and climate mitigation adaptation strategies, they tend to consider everything rather than energy. And similarly, when energy professionals are developing energy policies, plans, analysis, everything revolves around clean energy technologies and cleaner energy transition. They tend to forget what impact these systems are going to have on climate and how will it affect the future. But there has been a change in this thinking after the 2015 Paris Agreement, when the governments actually realized how energy is essential for them to do the climate negotiation and meet their standards. That is when energy efficiency, integration to renewable energy came into existence. Now, it is important to understand that energy is central to energy is central to all climate planning, and climate is central to all energy systems. Energy is in fact central to not just environmental sustainability, but all the SDGs, be it nutrition, be it gender equality, be it health. And we can see it in the past months as well. What's driving the today's world is basically data and energy. So it is important to develop strategies along these systems, and it becomes the responsibility of the government to develop policies in a manner so that it meets the economic and social benefits, but also at the same time takes into account the climate negotiations.
Thank you very much, Disha.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just saying that it is important for the sector to include youth, because whatever policies we are developing, if we are not taking youth into account, it does not make any sense. Because whatever we are doing today, the youth is going to feel the heat of it if it's not done in the right manner. So it becomes important to bring them on the platform, listen from them. And because the sector is so much polarized and politically driven, it sometimes becomes difficult to give them the right information. So the challenge most of us are facing, and what is the responsibility of the sector and the government is to publish as much data, as much good data as possible, and bring it out to the youth, because they are they are wonderful. They just bring out of the box thinking, and they are willing to do something. So it becomes the responsibility of the sector to engage them rather than asking them to do something, because if they're not provided with the correct information, it becomes useless.
Thank you, Disha. Well, for all those who are watching, we're about to begin the Q&A session. And so please send in your questions. We'll be back in a few minutes for the Q&A session. Steve, so the tone and tenor of what Disha had said, and also what others have said, is that clearly youth have a big role. But it's also true that youth are not sufficiently empowered. So my question to you is, what is the impact of initiatives such as the United Nations Young Champions of the Earth, a very impressive forward-looking prize for the youth with a vision for a more sustainable future? Are we doing enough to empower today's youth and recognize their contributions? How can we unite the green voices of the youth from across the world to scale their impact globally and, even more importantly, have them heard for policy changes? Are we in a very awkward situation where there is both asymmetry of information and power, which makes the role of the youth far less impactful than it can be? Steve.
Very difficult question, Raj, because as I said earlier, there are three directions in which youth can have an impact on policy decisions affecting the climate. It has to do with their mobilization that's dramatic that we saw earlier, that I think gets acknowledged politely, not always politely, but does not change things. Engaging in career paths that we alluded to and that Armin alluded to and that others have alluded to, including in the corporate sector, is a way in which youth with their awareness carried forward into their professional careers will make a difference. And the third is political, as citizens, engaging in political issues. But the point that I want to make sure I don't overlook during this webinar is that there are corridors of power, not just Davos where Greta Thunberg spoke, but corridors of power where youth need to be heard. We enumerated earlier the various UN agencies, 16 of them, that have youth programs in their climate agendas. And that's very good to have them, including an official role in the Framework Convention on Climate Change. But one of the most significant recent developments is a letter that was sent on the 26th of May, just a few days ago, by over 350 organizations representing over 40 million health professionals and over 4,500 individual health professionals from 90 countries, addressed to the G20, the 20 most powerful countries in the world, accounting for, I think, over 90% of the global GDP. And the letter begins, "Dear Prime Minister Narendra Modi, dear President Donald Trump," and add the other names to the list, Vladimir Putin and the rest, stating that health professionals stand united in support of a pragmatic, science-based approach to managing the COVID-19 pandemic and in supporting a hashtag healthy recovery. Well, the hashtag healthy recovery is now the agenda that is pushing the most powerful leaders in the world, including some of the most, some of the slowest to be on board to meet their obligations under the Paris Agreement, and including the major power that is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. Youth needs to be part of that process as well, not just at the various UN bodies that are meeting and not just at Davos, but also in this intervention of the health sector. So my conclusion here is that youth with the health sector have a common agenda and need to tell truth to power. And this letter of May 26th is a very clear example of telling truth to power. So I urge everyone to go to hashtag healthy recovery and to, and I'm sure many youth are already mobilized around it, but that needs to be done more systematically.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you to all the panelists, and we had a fascinating discussion, but I want to take it to our very distinguished audience. I have received over 200 questions, so let me try to navigate a few and ask you. So there's a question from Kulu, and this is mostly, I think Radhika should be able to answer this. Kulu is asking, what is the organizational structure available for youth to act effectively in environmental movements? How can they contribute?
Well, I don't think so. There's various organizations are, creating opportunities for them, like, Steve mentioned about United Nations. They are being encouraged, they are being asked to come, and they've been given an opportunity for that. But it's very, very informal. I don't think so. There is, I think UNEP and United Nations has this. IUCN, CBD also have, they encourage youth to come in. But there is, so different organizations are kind of welcoming youth, wanting the voice of youth, wanting them represented. So similarly in WWF also we have a youth advocacy group. So there are organizations are generally, creating these opportunities for people to be represented and do feel that they should participate.
Thank you so much, Radhika. There's a very interesting question from Vandana Gyanchandani. I'm going to ask maybe Steve to talk about it, or maybe even Armin. The question is, why is environmental law always studied or taught to control environmental externalities than imbibing sustainability across disciplines to ensure methods and means matter as much as ends?
Well, let me turn it over to Armin after saying the obvious, that a generalization about environmental law is a hazardous thing to say. Environmental law, and Armin is an authority on this, is taught in a variety of ways, taking into a variety of disciplines. And one of the strengths of having a school of environment and sustainability, and again, Armin will speak authoritatively about this, is that you can draw upon the full range of relevant disciplines, including law. But the legal field also allows for the role of youth and others to be involved in litigation, again, as Armin has pointed out. So it's not just one approach to the legal understanding of environmental law. It is the ways in which environmental law is evolving, taking into account advances in science and psychology and so many other fields. But I would like to turn this over to Armin, who would give a much more authoritative answer on the current state and prospects for environmental law.
Armin, you heard the question?
Yeah, well, environmental law is important in protecting land, air, water, biodiversity, species extinction, preventing species extinction. All of those things are important, and lawyers are, natural advocates, as are young people. I was thinking about the really young people, the high school people who might be listening to this webinar, and they should join us at Jindal in the School of Environment and Sustainability. We're going to be focused very heavily on climate change and energy, which people have been talking about. We'll also be talking about environmental regulation, forests, wildlife. So we want those people to join us and be part of our new school, be the pioneers, in fact, of our new school.
Thank you very much, Armin. Dr. Sinha, there's a very interesting question, which I think many people have battled it for a long time, and I'm sure you must have heard this question before. Mona Purohit is asking, how do we reconcile the age-old conflicts between the protection of wildlife on the one hand and the rights of people? You are at the thick and thin of the Rajaji National Park. You're familiar with the park versus people conflict, and also many things around the world. What ought to be the reconciling factor in these type of issues? Can you unmute yourself, Dr. Sinha?
Sorry, yeah. When we started off creating our protected areas, the model that we adopted was basically exclusionary. But over a period of time, the category of protected areas in India has also evolved from just the national park and the sanctuary now to include ideas like the community reserves and the conservation reserves and the like. which have much more flexibility in terms of accommodating direct requirements and needs of local communities. So times are changing, and to be very fair also, that in India today, the government system has helped create a network of more than 668 national parks and sanctuaries, almost 5% of the area set aside as protected areas, which is no small feat. So basically, the discourse is changing, the dialogue is changing, and protected area managers today are much better equipped in terms of engaging with local communities. We are using a lot of tools, including working with eco-development committees, working with village groups, in terms of trying to understand that if the forest survives, if the wildlife survives, then it is a win-win situation. And it is not one versus the other or one against the other. And as I said, this learning has had to happen on both sides of the divide. It's not
Thank you.
just that, you see, working in government, one of the things that I learned very early is that I'm responsible for anything that goes wrong here, which is fine. But at the same time, I think that it takes two to tango. And now, gradually, this whole debate has opened up much more. And I think that in today's time and in the times to come, we will see better resolution to these challenges as we've had in the past.
Thank you, Dr. Sinha, for your leadership and your contribution. Disha, there is a question from Karanveer Bhatt. Disha, are you around?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, the question is, how safe is nuclear energy and what risk does it pose to, particularly we've had serious incidents in many parts of the world, and more recently the tsunami event in Japan. There is clearly a divide between even serious environmental scholars about the use of nuclear energy. Some governments have tended to promote it more, and some others have been reluctant. And even within environmental, scholars, there is no consensus. So, what's your take on it?
So I would say that yes, nuclear energy does possess threats on environment, because as of now we are not able to identify the efficient manner of stabilizing it and actually dumping it in a safe and a secure manner. But then at the pace at which the world is moving and the pace at which the energy demand and need is growing, we need to find a balance between our requirements and how we are going to manage it. So not most, but some of the governments have been claiming and are working to develop nuclear energy plants. But then if I say about from the IEA perspective, I would say that there is a strong need to actually stabilize the demand and maybe not just directly jump on one energy fuel to other energy fuel, but actually make use of mechanisms like energy efficiency and clean energy technology to rather optimize the demand rather than moving in from one different fuel to another. So that I would say that nuclear energy does possess a threat, but then we need to find a solution and stabilize the demand in a manner.
Thank you very much, Disha. Steve, there's a question from Abhilasha Ramakrishnan. Abhilasha is asking, given that issues of climate change have given rise to claims based on the rights of future generations, is it time to formally ground the principle of intergenerational equity in international human rights law?
Yes.
You need more than that. Abhilasha will expect you more than that.
From the early 1970s, the awareness of the intergenerational impact of climate in general and specifically in the human rights field has been acknowledged. It is difficult, of course, to translate into specific norms how future generations are protected, but it is an underlying motivation of international environmental law, and I would add the international human rights agreements that incorporate the right to a clean and ecologically healthy environment. When I began my career back in the 70s working at the International Institute of Human Rights, which you mentioned in the introduction, actually there was already a draft protocol on this human right in the Council of Europe where we were working. It has evolved through various mutations, and there are, I forget the numbers, I used to know them by heart, but scores of countries that have it in their constitutions, and state constitutions in the United States that have a human right to the environment as a legally protected human right, focusing on the purpose being future generations. But what's important to note here is that at least for the future, the current special rapporteur, special procedure of the United Nations Council, Human Rights Council, has published his entire report to argue for a new convention, international convention on this right that would provide a legal basis for the rights of future generations as part of the mechanisms of guaranteeing the human right to a clean and ecologically balanced environment. So this is a process that has been actually explicitly on the agenda of human rights for 50 years. And we have, in 2020, a new opportunity with the proposal of the special rapporteur to have a new convention on this topic.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Well, there's one quick point I would add here, it's very important, is that some of the litigation that Armin was referring to, and he could jump in now to clarify, has been cleverly based on the young people who are proving not a damage to future generation, but a current damage to themselves from identifiable government policies where reports are on record that that damage will occur. So the abstract notion of impacts on future generations is not the cause of action that has led to some hope that this litigation will go somewhere, but the fact that young people can demonstrate a current harm for which they are trying to hold the US government accountable in the case of the US litigation.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. Radhika, there's a question which is, Yashi Agarwal is asking a question. Can you shed some light on the role of population explosion on climate change? How can youth, work towards addressing it? And what role can education institutions play in this regard?
Yeah, this is something that is really not talked about. And this is something that is really creating a huge demand. But because of political agendas, this is something that's really never, it's something that is very silent. And I think so it's extremely important. And I do believe education is the crux of everything. So it's up to us, I think so, youth, our educational institutes, colleges. I mean, this is something that we can kind of put into the system and educate them, and also the responsibility that, you have to be responsible for the children you have. So this is it's a very tricky question in that sense that, yeah, well, you can educate people, but it's a slow process. But yes, it should have been talked about years and years before. And I think so that's really causing a huge problem.
Thank you, Radhika.
Yeah.
Armin, there's a question possibly from a student who might have, Aditya is asking, he's enrolled in the BCom program of the Jindal School of Banking and Finance. And if he wants to take a cross-listed or some sort of a elective in your own school, is that possible? It's a question by a student who wants to take courses even though he or she is enrolled in another course.
We welcome all students who want to take any of our courses. We have 6 new courses, all of which will be available across all the boundaries of Jindal. So anyone who's interested is welcome to join, and we will embrace them.
Thank you very much. There is a question specifically about, and maybe I'll ask Dr. Sinha to talk about it. This is a question from Dhiren Shah. This question is that, why does the government not take enough action against private sector diverting liquid waste into rivers, and possibly polluting them and creating an environmental as well. The larger question is that to what extent we have environmental impact assessment effectively functioning, and what kinds of accountability can be there for those who are engaged in polluting activities.
Well, first of all, let me clarify that I'm not wearing my government hat for this webinar.
Of course.
I'm here as a student of environment, and in that capacity, let me see, as I said earlier, from the government perspective, it's never enough. I mean, there's a lot of work that is being done at the ground level, but yes, it's never enough because the goalposts keep shifting very rapidly. And as this pandemic has shown to us that when a lot of activities stop, then the environment can get itself into the reboot mode. So there's also important lessons for us. I would not agree to what my young friend is saying, that the government is not doing enough. All I would say is that yes, much more needs to be done, and we all need to work together on this. It's a separate debate all by itself, and again, a lot of specific issues can be taken up. I'm not sure we have the time or the canvas to discuss this right now. So
Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha, for that. One of the things which maybe, Steve, you should also weigh in a bit in this aspect. And there are people like Prateep Kumar and Sudeep Verma and Surabhi are all asking this question, is that to what extent environmental justice in the form of what the courts do should go, and courts and governmental powers should do, and should go hand in hand with environmental mediation or conciliation, and the whole framework of alternative dispute resolution that is there in many other areas. How far the more, let's say, culpability model of enforcing environmental regulations is effective on the one hand, as opposed to negotiated and dispute resolution settlement?
Tough question, because obviously...
Well, they are all asking tough questions, I must say.
Yeah, I'm about to talk about Bhopal, and Bhopal, of course, is a failure to provide adequate redress for the victims. It relied on the court system, but with some negotiations that took place. The details I'm not going to go into now, but it raises the problem that environmental harm and human harm of that magnitude was not satisfactorily settled by the balancing act between negotiations and judicial process. I also want to mention, I don't want to leave inaccurate information regarding the litigation I was alluding to earlier. The Juliana case, as I understand it, was dismissed after 5 years of litigation in January. But it mobilized youth, 21 plaintiffs, to try to bring the case. I think it's a failure to have held the US government accountable, to use that example to try to answer your question. It's a failure in the process, but I think it is an excellent mobilizing tool for people to acknowledge that the regulations that are in place when they are not abided by or not adequate, according to studies determined by the government itself, to protect people from harm, and that harm occurs, the government should be held accountable. It failed here, it should happen in the future. Will informal mechanisms work? I doubt it. And the reason I doubt it is because of the power imbalances. The energy sector, the fossil fuel industry is extremely powerful in the negotiating phase. And if you shift into an arbitration approach, alternative dispute settlement, the current power relations are such that the victims are going to lose. And the victims tend to be, and we haven't said this enough, tend to be racial, ethnic minorities and economic minorities. And something that hasn't been said throughout this entire time that should have been front and center from the beginning is the role and place of indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are the primary victims of the deforestation in the Amazon and in so many other areas where great harm is being done to them. The very people who understand better than any others, better than our finer scientists, the role of Mother Nature and the role of humans in the ecology. So I fear, given the current power relations, the effectiveness of arbitration mechanisms, and would like to see more robust judicial mechanisms so that cases like Juliana could lead to victory.
Thank you very much, Steve. In fact, even in the Indian context, the situation with regard to balancing, rights related to tribals, as well as other forms of environmental rights, including, companies engaged in different activities within forests. These issues have created huge conflicts. And many a time, not all the time, but many a time, there has been power imbalance. Although I must say that the role of courts in India have been quite progressive at various intervals. There's a question from Shrishti Ramani, and this is probably for Disha. Disha, this question is for, Disha, are you around?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, what are prospects for energy and petroleum sectors in the context of developing new environmentalism? Is there scope for young professionals to be able to work in these sectors and yet contribute towards building a deeper sense of responsible environmentalism, even while nudging the people who are engaged in the sector who might have other priorities?
Yes, definitely. In fact, this is the reason why the sector needs to bring in more youth together. And there are various platforms available. For example, there are platforms which in World Bank platform, UN platform, IFC platforms, wherein they engage with youth, teach them about the sector, and then they are sent on missions across different parts of the world, wherein they are working with the government, helping them to design their policies in a manner so that it has less impact. And that's what the role of these organizations are. Yes, so I would say that there is a possibility of working in the sector and then actually helping the developing countries and the developing countries, developing governments to design their policies, programs in a manner, being in the sector, that it meets their requirements, at the same time does not affect the climate and local air quality.
Thank you, Disha. Radhika, there's a question possibly which you can answer. Snehanjana Chatterjee is asking, how can we volunteer or work on projects that focus on environmentalism and wildlife, particularly in the context of how do you build a culture of volunteerism? I mean, the question really is that how do you permeate, environmental volunteerism at a broader scale that goes beyond individual organizations, NGOs, think tanks, research institutions?
Okay, so I have a very different opinion because, WWF has always had volunteers. I mean, people have always wanted to associate and contribute with us. So we always say that, people love the panda. And 6 years back, we felt that, while people are giving us so much, why don't we also, contribute back to these individuals who join us? And that's how we organized this, structured this program. So all I'm saying is that I'm quite, like today we have nearly 26,000 volunteers working with us. And I'm quite taken aback how young, and the majority are young people. So I do feel people have that spirit. So my impressions are that I have really seen that spirit there with people, and they do really come forward. And some young children do come because of a certificate, but then that's our job to hook them into the sector. So I have seen a lot of contribution, and WWF has seen before me many people coming to volunteer with us. So we've seen a little different, but I think so organizations like us must create opportunities. And I think so UN, everybody does do that. So there is that's something we all encourage. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Armin, there's a question from Ajit Khannan. Ajit is asking, what is the scope for having a comprehensive climate change legislation in India and even other countries around the world that translates some of the larger international legal obligations into more domestic setting? And if we were to do that, to what role does environmental schools like the one that you are heading can play and contribute?
Definitely, we need an international as well as a national climate change legislation and program. Climate change is probably going to be the biggest challenge for the current generation and the one or two to come. It's getting worse, and the damage, the impacts of climate change are going to be harder and harder to deal with, particularly since we can't control it just in one country. It's an international issue, and most countries are not going to be available to us. So we have to do it through strict, strategic, and discrete management. We have to work together with other countries. We have to work together with other generations. We have to work together with other corporations, with other governments, with NGOs. Everybody's got to work on it, both individually and collectively. And that's the only way we're going to deal with it. And that's the big challenge for this generation of young people. Climate change is not going to go away. It's only going to get worse. And we have to address the impacts, and we have to do it now.
Thank you, Armin. Dr. Sinha, there's a question, possibly you can answer, but maybe others can. Shivani Bhatt is asking about the opinion of panelists on animal agriculture being a major contributor to GHG as well, and to what extent, even the issues surrounding sustainable agriculture has posed a major challenge for environmental sustainability, and to what extent we can actually persuade even the governments to take it seriously.
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer this question, but I'll still try. You see, animal-based power is again one of the very important contributors to agriculture sector in most of the developing world even today. That change is not easy to make because it increases dependence again on fossil fuels and all other things which may not always be within the reach of a small land tenure holding person. So these are not easy choices to make, and gradually, yes, it's not just about agriculture. Cattle are reared for a variety of other reasons as well, and far more larger numbers. So I think we should also have an understanding that it is not just about the number of cattle that are engaged in agriculture that contribute to this. There are far more larger number of cattle across the world that are being reared for entirely different reasons. And that should also be considered in this equation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha. Steve, there's a question from Surabhi, and this is, of course, a question that you and many of us have confronted. Why is it that global warming and climate change still looked upon with skepticism in many parts of the world, including by none other than the President of the United States of America?
Well, can I take this, make a few quick comments on this before?
Yes, please.
I think one of the challenges that we face today is of information overload. I mean, recently I was appalled to know that since January, we published more than 23,000 academic papers on COVID. And it's similar about climate change. The problem with the climate change debate is that a lot of us have left it to scientists to interpret the climate change issues amongst themselves. And so as a common person, I feel that I may not have anything significant to contribute to this debate. This is something that creates a problem. So I think one of the important things that we, as individuals and as institutions that we represent, must do is to bring out these kind of what appear to be esoteric technological discussions out into the open and make the common person a participant rather than a bystander to this whole debate. I think that is where we are losing. There's very little by way of popular writing on these themes, and a lot of academic writing, which is in many ways preaching to the pulpit.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha. Steve, you want to continue with that question?
Yeah, but, let me reciprocate and make an observation about
Agriculture.
the previous point, and then say a word about deniers. The animal food industry, factory farming, is a major factor in the deforestation of the lungs of the planet in the Amazon region, and is a matter of grave concern for climate change. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned that has undercut our understanding of how to respond to climate change and how youth will respond to climate change for the last 50 years that we've been discussing it are consumption patterns. The consumption of meat has multiplied 20-fold from what it was before the industry started mass production of animal meat products. And this has wreaked havoc on diets and on the planet. It is a factor in the climate change crisis, and an extremely important one. So it has two dimensions to it. One is, how do you regulate this extremely powerful industry that is doing so much harm? And secondly, how do you alter behaviors by consumers so that the demand ceases to be there to keep this industry going? And now let's translate that issue of consumption patterns to the whole range of climate issues that we've been discussing. It's exceedingly important. And that's going to make it all the more difficult. I'm making a segue now to the question about deniers. That's going to make it all the more difficult for people who are used to eating their junk food, used to eating meat with every meal, used to having high sugar content beverages and so on, to change their habits because of an understanding of the science behind it is an enormous leap that is going to be resisted by extremely powerful industries with their advertising tools, their advertising agencies. So we do have an enormous challenge there. Why are there still deniers among high-powered political individuals? It relates to the problem I alluded to earlier, and I'll simply condense it in one word: the very nature of authoritarian populist regimes. The knowledge that comes from the scientific community is rejected for the purpose of mobilizing people in favor of the political power of the individual involved, and it's extremely dangerous for the functioning of democracies and for the application of a science-based, evidence-based approach. I'd like to disagree, if I may, with Samir on one point. I have observed, of course, I'm surrounded by the people who generate the incomprehensible scientific studies, incomprehensible to the general public scientific studies, and are speaking to one another about it. It surrounds me all the time in all the work of the AAAS that I'm involved in, all the work of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and many other fora. However, I've also admired the extent to which various organizations translate that into understandable things. It is the role of the media to do so, and I must acknowledge many media have done extremely well on that, and it is the role of scientific organizations to translate it. Perhaps it's not good enough, and you're probably right on that. It's not good enough to get it done, but there are many organizations that are doing it. The problem is to reach the politicians who have their own interests that lead them to continue to be part of the deniers, and that's one of the tragedies of our generation.
Thank you, Steve. I
and
have
that's
another.
Calling into account on that, of course.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Steve. I have another 100+ questions unanswered, and I'm not going to take it. So we are slowly coming to the end of this session. Radhika, there's a question from Shireen. Shireen is asking about, the focus of most governments, including the current government, has been on 4 E's: education, employment, entrepreneurship, excellence. How can the youth work towards making environment, the 5th E, a priority for government action?
Well, it's going to be something that we have to demand I also feel that, and that's why, we started this whole simulation, because we feel children should understand advocacy and constructive advocacy. And I think so we will have to demand this. Um, NCRT very clearly says they have kind of failed with environment education. It's been in the book, and that's not what environment education should be. So definitely in the system there has been some failure, and we just need to ask for the right kind of environment education. And also I do feel definitely nothing is stopping us from changing our behavior. Like we become such a society that's so much into consumption. It's our choice if we consume less. So also it's marketing. It's people have brainwashed us that we need so many houses and cars and things. Of course this has to be very thoughtfully done, because I'm putting a disclaimer, because it's environment, it's social, it's economy, it's all interrelated. But I think so we have to demand this. Organizations like us definitely will also be playing a very active role in trying to mainstream it, and the kind that is needed on behavior change, and which is needed also for building skills. So I think so that kind of, yeah.
Thank you very much, Radhika, for that. That's very, very useful, and I'm sure it answered the question. There's a question for Dr. Sinha. Kritika Ranjan is asking about the coexistence among tribals and wildlife. And she's talking about a model, and I'm not familiar with it, so maybe you should be able. It's called a Tadoba model across the country. What is the scope for implementing this model, and how effective they could be?
Thank you, Kritika. That's a very interesting question. It has been said before that India is a continent masquerading as a country. What works in Tadoba need not necessarily work even in other protected areas in Maharashtra. So what I would suggest is that we have to learn from each other's successes. We also have to learn from each other's failures, and each place has its own nuances, which make some things work and some things not to work. So while the Tadoba model is excellent, I'm sure that you would also be interested to know of similar work happening also in Uttarakhand, for example, in places like Rajaji in Corbett, also in Nanda Devi. There have been a lot of initiatives that have actually worked, even though they may be at a small scale and may not have been talked about that widely. So I think what is important is to learn from these kind of initiatives, to build upon these success stories, and create more success stories of our own, each in our own small way.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha. Disha, there's one question for you. This question is about how do we create and build trust between different stakeholders. There is a high level of distrust that prevails on the people who are in the private and corporate sector in the energy side, and then there are people who are actually potentially be adversely affected. Then there are, of course, government organizations which are involved and civil society. So in a multi-stakeholder consensus model, how do you build a trust between these stakeholders when it comes to creating a higher degree of environmental sustainability?
I would say it's simple. We just need to talk more. We just need to communicate the ideas more and involve each and every stakeholder from the very beginning. It won't work if we develop a plan, a policy, and then communicate it to people. Okay, so we are coming with a range of energy efficient appliances, and now you have to use it. The first question would be, why would I use an energy efficient appliances? It costs me more, and I don't know the benefits of it. So it's important to involve each and everyone from the very beginning, communicate, and because whatever policies we design, it might be, there might be some private companies or maybe government which will produce these policies, but then the beneficiary will be someone else. So we need to bridge the gap, bring everyone together, and that's the only way to involve everyone and build the trust.
Thank you very much, Disha. Armin, there is one question for you. The question is that to what extent you think that an undergraduate studies in environmental programs, such as the one that the School of Environmental Sustainability is offering, is going to create and in many ways have the conversation surrounding multiple stakeholders in protecting the environment. In many ways, to what extent that will translate into meaningful action in the ground?
At the moment, we have a dearth of leadership throughout the world. We have people like Trump, to a lesser extent, Modi, Bolsonaro, people who are not offering enlightened leadership. They're disavowing the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We need new leaders. Greta Thunberg is one. People watching this program are probably among the new leaders. The young people are certainly among the new leaders. We can't do without them. The other thing that definitely needs to happen is reconnect with nature. A lot of people just, are not involved in protecting nature and therefore not involved in protecting the environment. We need to climb hills, climb mountains, deep dive into the sea, rediscover nature, travel on rivers. We need people to not only love nature, but love nature enough to protect it.
Thank you, Armin. All right, let's move to the last question, which is open to all of you now. For all the youth who are watching this discussion, what would you like to tell them on how they can evolve into responsible green citizens and environmental change makers? Lifestyle changes, environmental studies, environmental related careers. What are the ways for them to contribute to saving the world from the next big crisis in our environment? Let me begin by asking Steve to respond to that question.
Thank you, Raj, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this event. I've alluded to the three ways in which I think youth can advance this cause. I would like to conclude with a challenge to youth, and I do so by quoting Disha's boss. It's unfortunate that it hasn't been alluded to previously because the International Energy Agency has just published its Global Energy Review 2020. I'm going to conclude with a message that sounds depressing for youth, but in fact may be a cause for hope. The title is Nothing to Cheer. Fatih Birol, the executive director of IEA, recently said in introducing this Global Energy Review 2020 of IEA, quote, resulting from premature deaths and economic trauma around the world, the historic decline in global emissions is absolutely nothing to cheer. Now, let me put that in context in one sentence and conclude. What Fatih is alluding to is the fact that emissions have declined by 8%. 8% is what we need every year to achieve the goal set by the Paris Agreement to keep emissions at to keep global warming at less than 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial temperatures. But this drop that we've had of exactly the amount that we need to do every year was due to reasons that we don't want to cheer about because we obviously don't want the health issue and the economic issue. So what remains for us to do, and this is the challenge to youth, is to maintain that 8% every year from now on, and it's going to require massive mobilization that will not occur without the full engagement of youth. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Radhika, same question.
Yes, I will end this on hope. And I would say that, in WWF, we come up with a paper. It's called the Living Planet Report. So it talks about the status of the planet, which is sad, but it also says that if we act together now, we can bend the curve. So we believe that, we can have a new deal for nature. And I think so it begins with our own behavior. So we should not undermine that. It definitely believes, I also would say that you should take leadership. So it's yourself, it's you should take leadership. You should understand, because many a times we don't understand situations and we just react to them. So I would really, urge them to also understand the issues and look for solutions. So for me, there's hope out there, and I really believe they should lead the way. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha.
Well, let me go back to what Mahatma Gandhi ji once famously said, that you must be the change you wish to see in the world. And that's what I would like to reiterate. Every one of us, especially the youth today, we need to think of what we can do ourselves, howsoever small it may seem. And as a young country, I also realize that the youth has a lot of purchasing power, for example. So if we decide to bring about small changes, if we decide to buy goods and services that are sustainable, if we decide to bring about small lifestyle changes, that howsoever small it may appear to be, but make a positive impact, I think in the long run, we would be making a very valuable contribution. So while the big things are important, the larger picture is important. At the same time, each individual amongst us, if we decide to make even one small change as we go along, I think the battle would largely be won.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha. Disha?
Yeah, I would just end by saying that become self-conscious. It's easy to blame the government. It's easy to blame the researchers, the scientists, but start calculating your own carbon footprint. Start realizing that what impact you as an individual are having on the environment. And once you do so, naturally the sustainable living will become a part of you. And yeah, that's the way to go ahead, go about it.
Armin, you have the last word.
Okay. Education, leadership, political action, protecting nature. Those are the conclusions that I would reach from this webinar. And I hope that all the people who are watching and participating will take political action, will pursue educational opportunities, including my program at Jindal, will exercise leadership, which the current leaders are totally lacking in, and will protect nature. And then in that way, I think we're going to protect the environment and sustainability.
Thank you very much. Well, we have come to the end of a fascinating discussion that we had for the last 2 hours. This could not have been held at a more opportune time as we are just a couple of days from the celebration or marking of the World Environmental Day on the 5th of June. I want to take this opportunity to thank my distinguished guests, Professor Dr. Armin Rosenkrantz, Professor Stephen P. Marks, Dr. Sinha, Radhika, and Disha. Thank you very much for your time. It has been an absolute pleasure and delight for me to have this interactive session. Thank you for all the questions that have come from our audience. I'm very sorry that we couldn't take more questions than we would have liked to, but we really appreciated you participating in this discussion. I want to end by saying that youth do have a phenomenal opportunity here to make the world a better place. And our education and leadership and opportunity to seek change and transformation begins with this process that we talked about today. And I'm very confident that these are moments when we can rise up to the challenge. The global pandemic, if there is anything it has taught us, is that we cannot take things for granted. And that is exactly where we should begin when it comes to seeking environmental change and protecting sustainability. With those words, once again, I would like to thank our very distinguished guests. On behalf of the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability and OP Jindal Global University, I want to thank all of you for your participation here. I also want to let you know that starting 5th of June, we are beginning a new series of colloquiums under the aegis of the International Institute for Higher Education, Research and Capacity Building on the theme, The Future of Education. It will be a fortnightly show that we'll be partnering with the noted magazine Education World. And we have the first discussion on the occasion of the World Environmental Day. I will be moderating a panel comprising of Dr. Shalini Advani, Director of Pathways School, Noida, Mr. Arun Kapoor, former headmaster and founding headmaster of Vasant Valley School and director of the Royal Academy, Bhutan, Ms. Vanita Uppal, director of the British School in New Delhi, Mr. Dilip Thakur, publisher and editor of Education World and Parents World, and Dr. Maushami Mukherjee, associate professor and deputy director of the Institute of Higher Education at OP Jindal Global University. I look forward to seeing you on 5th June, Friday at 6 p.m. Thank you very much, and it has been a pleasure talking to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.